What is up, everybody? Following the shuffle bus? Well, I'm going to be doing another deck tech. This is an updated list that I played in my week 2 of a. This is my full deck. You might have watched last week's video, full Fallen Killer. Still working out a better name for it. Maybe it's going to be what. But this is an updated version of it. After playing a few test games, one of them you saw last week on the public, where I played against the Fallen deck and just couldn't quite get there when I was playing against a James Fallen deck that had spectral charger mounts and the mount, and so that bigger threat, which we kind of talked about, might be a weakness of the deck. I decided I was too overly invested in Fallen removal with Into Miss or Out of the Miss and 100 Blades. I decided 100 Blades was enough, and Out of the Miss was sort of expensive, and it would open up a slot in my deck for either more of some of the same cards or some of that other stuff. So the really quick snapshot of this is that I pulled out the Out of the Miss, which was do one to all my opponent's units and then draw a card. And I made some modifications from there. Actually, it ended up being quite a few. It changed the makeup of the deck pretty substantially. So I just want to go through it with you because I think the best course of action is for me to be sharing all of my updates as we work through them and as the deck evolves. I don't know if I'll continue to play this every week in AIL, but I do intend to continue to test it and continue to refine it because I think the deck is probably pretty good. And I think it fights pretty well in many cases. I just see a lot of Fallen decks. Although, there are big decks, there are big swingy decks out there, and this will still not be perfectly suited for them. It's just intended to be enough. Not intended to be, obviously, if it was the best deck, right, like then just everybody would play this, and that's just not the way Ashes works out. There are still going to be some bad matchups for Cole, but it's not going to rely as heavily on slash and direct damage spells to try to get there either. It's got just some standard removal in the illusion set and kind of buying more into the crescendo move, some of those things. That way it can play a little more aggressive because there are just times like with Salamander Monks, for example, you just have to do things. So let's just go through the list again. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on past stuff. I will link below in the description last week's video that'll give you the baseline for version 1 of this deck. This is essentially version 2. So still staying with some things. I still think there's room to modify this deck a little bit, but let's just jump right in. So first change was I got rid of the Abundance for Changing Winds. Based on my experience, Abundance, it just gives my opponent too much value. And I don't want them to have value in a deck where I'm trying to gain incremental value through things like card advantage, through things like call ability, some of those things. And so giving my opponent just 2 cards just means that they can keep pressuring me constantly as well. And so I changed out of Abundance. I went back to Changing Winds. And I just like the fact that I get a little dice fixing, I get a little card draw. It's cycle right out of the gate. So ideally what you're kind of doing is laying down your first 5 minus 1, so you can kind of pick whatever is the card you don't want and put it on the bottom and get 2 cards, put 2 cards on the bottom. So there's a really great article from a Magic player called Louis Scott Vargas out on Channel Fireball. I don't remember what it's called. If I can find it, I'll link it in the description as well. But it talks about looting, and basically looting is when you draw from the top of the deck. And in that case, it's a discard. And in Ashes, we have a few different effects that are like this. And I think that anytime you're going to be playing with spell boards that require focusing, you're going to want to loot like as much as possible. And that's why Abundance was my first choice. But I just think that it has too much. I got to my focus too fast enough, is what I'm saying, in my test games, that it gave my opponent too much tempo as well to give them 2 cards. So ultimately, we landed on Changing Winds in that slot instead. Still open for debate on whether or not I've got the right ready board set up, but still there. So I do have 3 resonances. Obviously, we don't intend to focus. One of the secondary targets for resonance in the old version of this deck was abundance. So that as a secondary win con, if you could get your opponent to draw out, you could sort of ping them with your abundance. That just didn't come to fruition in my test games, and it seemed just like it was a little bit too much of a reach. I just would rather use, if I get extra copies of Resonance or I get extra copies of the Shadowhound after it's been focused, I would just rather have those to use directly for the purposes of pinging with Cole's ability. Or if I'm sitting on, like, here's something that I was thinking about after some gameplay. If I'm sitting on Shadowhound, Resonance, Shadowhound, Resonance, like I can meditate one of these resonances away, and then my main action play second Shadowhound. And not that I'm going to cast the Shadowhound, but it's sort of a stall tactic, and I get a free resonance off of something that I don't need any longer to the bin. So, but at the same time, if I'm happy with just, double resonance Shadowhound, and in certain game states I might be, then my second copy of Shadowhound in hand is just deal 1 damage from Cole's ability. So, it just gives me that flexibility, that playstyle flexibility to do what I need to do in a given situation based on what's best. So yes, still have the 3 copies of the Shadowhound. Again, there is some redundancy there when you talk about 3 resonances and 3 Shadowhounds, but our goal is, sorry, that's the Salamander. Our goal is to push out Focus 2 versions of Shadowhound with a fair amount of consistency. And I think that it's very possible to do that in this. So that's something to keep in mind. I am still playing just a single copy of the Salamander Monk. I would like to see a way to get to this. I'm sort of thinking through the process of getting to a second copy or even third copy of Salamander Monk. And I think just more games are necessary to figure out my matchups and what's good, what's bad, and what I need to do there. Because if I can get those extra copies, Salamander Monk is a very cost-effective unit that I can play 2 of a turn. 2 dice, 2 units, 2 main actions. It's slow. It's not going to be fast. But the fact is that you get the Shadow Monk spirits that way, and with a battlefield of 6, we've got a lot of room in this deck for flooding the battlefield with the Shadow Spirits. And they're sort of problematic for your opponent. Like, they can't favorably just deal with them, so you can kind of continue to just pressure your opponent with them. And it's sort of a similar sort of effect as if there's no units on the board and Cole is just pinging. So I do like the Salamander Monk a lot. Whether or not it's going to end up as second, third copy, I think it's just, like I said, more games needed. But that's something that is in the back of my brain right now with this deck. Still playing 1 copy of the False Demon. So I misevaluated this card in the early version. I thought every time you played a False Demon, you got yourself a unit that pinged for 1 when it came into play. So I thought it was like a Flash Archer. What I learned after playtesting is it's only to an exhausted unit. So it's a little more niche. It's a little more difficult to pull off. Not impossible, but a little more difficult to pull off. And it makes it more reactionary. And so I'm not sold on this yet, but I don't know what I would put in its place quite yet, because it's fairly dice efficient. If you look, the demon itself costs nothing to put on the board. 2 dice to summon the demon. You get a 2/2 for 2. Not terrible. Not super great either. So, but I don't really have the dice to flip over and go to like a Frostback Bear, which would be ideal here. I don't necessarily want to put the bear in and then have to change my dice composition, because with 5 dice and Shadowhound, it's really, this is using, 60% of your illusion pool just to cast a single Shadowhound. So that makes it challenging to go down to a 4th die here. And whether I can afford to go to 3rd die Sympathy, but even if I go to 2 Nature, it's still going to be really hard to play Frostback Bear and summon a Frostback Bear turn 1, whereas I can still play single copy Shadowhound. I can still play a single copy of Resonance, get my dice back, still play a False Demon on round 1, even if the False Demon doesn't ping anything. So, and I still have then the ability to play Salamander Monk. So I can play all my ready spells and get my board presence set up turn 1 just on dice built into the system. So, I think that's just kind of the perfect thing to be doing. So I'm not sold on what should be here yet, but this is something that is sort of on the quote unquote chopping block, if you will. But just something to keep in mind. All right, so we're still running the 3 Battle Seers. I was correct in that I need to have the ability to have bigger threats. If you're playing against a Fallen list and they're not playing a bunch of big threats and they really are just all little threats, you're probably not going to cast Battle Seer. You're probably not, right? Like, because you're going to probably just go ahead and continue to ping out Shadowhounds and use Shadowhounds aggressively to remove your opponent's board state, because you can just play a second copy of Shadowhound and ping more stuff on their board. So the Shadowhound gives you a lot more value in those matchups, but in matchups where they're going to play like a Snake, Silver Snake, or they're going to play, just thinking through any of the alert units, like any of the Knights, you're going to want to put a reasonably sized threat on the battlefield. And what Battle Seer does for you that you can't really discount here is that Battle Seer gives you the opportunity to kill something without it dying, right? So if you can ping a 4 life Knight down by 1 with Coal ability, main action attack Seer into it, now you've killed that, and you still got a Battle Seer on the battlefield. Although your Battle Seer will now be exhausted, so you do have to worry about the potential for your opponent to come back at you. And so you need to be thinking about what sort of things they could be coming back at with. But if you can get yourself favorably set up, I think she's still really good for the taller matchups. And so I'm not going to take her out. I like River Scald a ton. Don't know how much you're going to use the ping ability on the Scald, but it's sort of like a free version of the Coal ability. So you may. But at the very least, it's draw more cards, which fuels Coal. And I think that's completely fine. I went to 3rd copy of Expand Energy since I got rid of the Abundance. I thought Expand Energy. I just had a lot of games. Not a lot. I haven't played a ton of games with this deck so far, but I had a fair number of games where I just ended up with no cards in hand, and so Expand Energy is just perfect for being able to refill your hand to do something with it. Because there does become a board state sometimes where you have 2 Shadowhounds. You can't cast any more Shadowhounds. And so you've just got dice. You have dice for days at that point. So if that happens, like Expand Energy is a great tool to give you more cards to use your dice with. Still have 2 copies of Hidden Power in the list. I think I'm leaning towards Hidden Power being one of my starting 5, but I'm not sold on that yet. So just because, well, if you saw the game I played last week on stream, you saw round 1, I had to meditate basically 7 in that matchup. And that's a lot of cards to come out of the top of your deck. And ultimately, I lost that game because of fatigue damage right as the deck was starting to turn the corner and actually win the game. So I think that Hidden Power is good because, number 1, I get a card, which is playing right into the strategy of the deck. It costs 1 die, and I can change 5 dice to a side of my choice. So there's a chance that I'm considering this for my first 5. I have to think through how the dice will get spent in my opening 5 then, because essentially I'm not playing like one of these ready spells, because my original first 5 is Changing Winds, Salamander Monk, Shadowhound, Resonance, and Summon False Demon, right? So we're just sort of going to go, okay, we're not going to buy into the fast Shadowhound plan, because we kind of have to go pull Resonance back, play Hidden Power, and then hope that Hidden Power draws us between Changing Winds and Hidden Power draws us something good. The downside to this is, okay, so you'd kind of have to go, okay, first play of the game, we're gonna roll our dice, and if our dice are bad, then we're gonna Hidden Power right out of the gate. So now one of our illusion die are gone. This is assuming that we can do that without meditating, and then we would fix 5 dice to match the things we want for the rest of the turn, right? So now we start going through. I mean, there will be 1,000 variations based on what our opponents do from here, but the next step would be, okay, so we draw a card from the top of the deck. We don't know what that's going to be, but it's something, right? And then we go, okay, is that a Resonance? If it's not, then whatever that card is worse than Resonance, right? Maybe with the exception of Expand Energy or Exception of Second Copy. These would be the 3 cards we would be digging for in that first 5. Right? So we'd be looking for those 3 cards to make it all sort of work out. And do you want to put that into the hands of fate and drawing and shuffling, or would you rather not play Hidden Power in the opening, like we were talking about, and have Resonance and just move right directly into the plan that you want to execute right out of the gate? And I think this is still the correct start, but I will be testing the Hidden Power start because I'm curious about it. Okay, so let's keep going here. I did add a sleight of hand to the deck. This is yet another way for me to dig for the cards that I'm looking for. This could also be in my starting, right? Because I could go, okay, leave Resonance back, play sleight of hand in my starting 5, and then just draw 3 cards. So I can go, okay, spend this, spend this or whatever, depending on how the rolls look, play sleight of hand, draw 3 cards. I've got 2 dice spent now, but remember that I can play if I draw a Resonance off those 3, I can now do the same thing. I can play double Sympathy, this, and get back probably. So the best course of action would probably be to play it like this, and then go Resonance, go double Sympathy, and one of these. I'm only down 1 illusion die for the whole round, and I can fix the illusion die now against the Shadow Hound. And so now I have these 3 dice. I still have 1 dice left to get my False Demon out. I still have 4 dice for the Salamander Monk and the Changing Winds. So I still think we can get it done that way. So this may be the way I start also. But again, it goes back to you're sort of crossing your fingers that you're either going to draw Shadow Hound or Resonance off of that if you do this. So more testing is going to be needed to see how consistent that is. I decided to go with Out of the Mist because in a lot of game states, my units are not interactable, right? So Shadowhounds are going to be out. Salamander Monks, my opponent doesn't want to kill them. So there's just this board state that exists a lot of times where I have 2 to 3 units. And because I have 2 to 3 units, this is just a 2-die side action, deal 2 or 3. It's not super cheap. I mean, when we talk about cost, it's not super cheap, but I have the 1 nature die. So with access to the 1 nature, I thought, well, let's maybe. It's still on the fence for me. I may be cutting the nature just in general from this deck as we move forward, but it's either that or I start looking at making some changes into this pool to make it easier to play Frostback Bear. So I've got 2 Out of the Mist. They're not a 3 of in the deck. They're a 2 of. But I wanted something that I could deal with bigger threats. Still got the 100 Blades as a 3 of. I also went ahead and added 2 copies of Fadeaway. Cheap, not like a great dice removal or unit removal because it's till the end of the round. But if you time this properly, you can get away with a pretty favorable trade sometimes. So, anyways. Just felt like a much better alteration to be considering when we were looking at the deck. So this is version 2 of the Cold deck. Still a work in progress. We'll continue to update it on the channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the little bell icon to get notified when I put new content up. And we'll see you soon with Week 2's AIL gameplay.